In the unforgiving heart of 1878 Wyoming, a woman's world was measured in two things: rifle cartridges and inches of snowfall. Her name was Abigail Parsons, and she was a ghost on the frontier. A widow with nothing left to her name but a tiny cabin and the silence of the pines. But that silence was about to be shattered by a child's scream. What happened next was an act of raw courage against one of nature's most terrifying forces. But the real story, the one that matters, it didn't begin with a fight. It began after the blood had dried. It's a story of suspicion, a trial of survival, and a decision that would rewrite the laws of the frontier, uniting two worlds against a common enemy that was far worse than any bear. The wind that swept down from the Bighorn Mountains had a voice. Most days it was a lonesome whisper, but sometimes it was a howl that rattled the single pane of glass in her cabin window, a constant reminder of how utterly alone she was. She'd buried her husband, Caleb, 2 years back. He was a man of big dreams, saw this valley as their own private Eden. He felled the trees, notched the logs, built their future with his own two hands. Then a timber accident, a crushing finality, and Abigail was left with the cabin, Caleb's rifle, and the echo of his laughter in the wind. But she was not a fragile woman. The West had burned that away, leaving someone lean, hard, and resilient. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, missed nothing. The twitch of a deer's ear at 100 yards, the first sign of a blizzard in the clouds. She had to be sharp. Her nearest neighbor was a day's ride east. The settlement of Buffalo was a distant memory. Her world was this valley, this cabin, and the heavy Winchester Model 1873 that leaned, ever ready, by the door. Lately, though, a new feeling had settled over the valley. It wasn't loneliness, it was the unnerving sensation of being watched. Not by a mountain lion, by human eyes. Twice she'd found a single moccasin print near the creek. It wasn't a careless track from a hunter passing through. It was placed deliberately. A message, a silent declaration. I am here. I am watching you. She knew the stories. Displaced tribes, pushed ever westward, their desperation making them unpredictable. Whispers in Buffalo had spoken of the Cherokee, driven from their homes, their pride wounded, their trust in her kind non-existent. So Abigail doubled her vigilance. The Winchester became an extension of her arm. She reinforced the bar on her cabin door and slept with a Colt pistol tucked beneath her burlap pillow. Her fear wasn't the trembling kind. It was a cold, sharp thing, a tool. It honed her senses and kept her finger light on the trigger. One crisp afternoon, with the sky bleeding orange and purple, she was checking her snare lines. The air went still, deathly still. The squirrels and birds fell silent. Abigail froze, her hand resting on the smooth, worn stock of the Winchester. She sank into a crouch behind a screen of aspens, her eyes scanning the deep woods. And that's when she heard it, a sound that turned her blood to ice, the high, terrified scream of a child. It was followed by a sound from the deepest pits of primordial terror, the guttural, earth-shaking roar of a grizzly bear. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to bolt for the cabin, bar the door, and let the wilderness do its brutal work. That was the smart choice, the survivor's choice. But the child's cry came again, closer this time, laced with a pain so sharp it cut right through her own fear. In that single desperate sound, Abigail heard the echo of everything she'd lost, the children she and Caleb would never have. The cold tool of her fear was suddenly forged into a hot, righteous fury. A child was about to be extinguished by the same brutal wilderness that had taken her husband. Without a second thought, she broke from cover and ran toward the sound, the heavy Winchester feeling as light as a feather in her hands. The laws of survival were about to be broken. The story of the silent widow in the lonely valley was about to end, and a new, far more dangerous one was about to begin. The forest floor, a carpet of pine needles, muffled her footsteps. The roaring was louder now, a continuous rumbling threat that vibrated through the soles of her boots. Through a break in the trees, she saw it. A massive grizzly, a mountain of muscle and matted fur, stood on its hind legs, silhouetted against the failing light. It was enormous, its head swaying from side to side, yellow teeth bared in a terrifying snarl. Pinned against a rock face was a boy, no more than 9 or 10 years old, straight black hair, skin the color of burnished copper. In his small hand, he clutched a knife that looked like a toy. His face was a mask of terror, but his eyes held a spark of defiance. He was Cherokee, the moccasin prince, the feeling of being watched. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The bear dropped to all fours with a ground-shaking thud and swiped. The claws, each as long as a man's finger, tore through the air. The boy scrambled sideways, the claws missing his face by inches, but catching his shoulder, ripping through buckskin and flesh. He cried out, a sharp gasp of pain, and stumbled. That's when Abigail arrived. No time for a plan. No time for a clean shot. There was only the bear, the boy, and the certainty of death. "Hey!" she screamed, her voice raw and loud. "Over here!" The grizzly's massive head snapped around, its small black eyes fixing on her. It let out another roar, a direct challenge. It was just the moment the boy needed, a precious second to scramble away from the rock wall. Abigail raised the Winchester. Caleb's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't aim for the head, Abby. Too much bone. Aim for the boiler room." The bear charged. It was an avalanche of fury. The ground trembled. Abigail stood her ground, her world narrowing to the brass beat of her front sight and the charging mass of fur and teeth. She let it come, her heart hammering against her ribs. 20 yards, 15. Crack. The first shot was true, striking the bear high in the chest. The grizzly staggered, a grunt of pain and surprise erupting from its lungs. But it didn't stop. A wounded grizzly is exponentially more dangerous. 10 yards. Abigail worked the lever action, the motion smooth and swift. Shuck chick. A fresh round in the chamber. Crack. The second shot hit lower, closer to the center of its massive chest. The bear stumbled, its front leg buckling. Blood matted its fur, dark and slick. It was hurt badly, but its momentum was unstoppable. A locomotive of pure rage. 5 yards. She could smell its foul breath. She could see the feral light in its eyes. She worked the lever again, but her sweaty hand fumbled the motion for a split second. The moment was lost. No time for another shot. The bear rose up, towering over her, its shadow swallowing her whole. A paw wide as a dinner plate swung down. Abigail didn't scream. She reacted. Dropping the rifle, she threw herself sideways, landing hard. Pain shot through her ribs, but she was clear. The bear's claws gouged deep furrows in the earth where her head had been. As it landed off balance from its missed swipe, she saw her only opening. Scrambling on her hands and knees, she grabbed the heavy-bladed hunting knife from her belt. The bear was turning, its jaws snapping just feet from her. She didn't have the strength to pierce its thick hide. But Caleb had taught her something else, a desperate last-ditch move. As the bear lunged, she drove herself forward under its snapping jaws and thrust the knife blade up with all her weight, deep into the soft, unprotected flesh of its throat. Hot blood gushed over her hand and arm. The bear let out a choked, gurgling roar of shock and agony. It thrashed its head wildly, and a back-swinging claw caught her side, its talons slicing through her jacket and flesh like razors. White-hot fire seared her ribs, but she held on, pushing the knife deeper. The beast's struggles grew weaker. It staggered back, a grotesque fountain of blood pumping from the mortal wound. It took 2 more lurching steps. Then its legs gave out. It collapsed with a final shuddering sigh that shook the very ground. Silence. Abigail lay on the ground, gasping for air, her sides screaming in agony. Slowly, she pushed herself up, soaked in the bear's blood, her own blood seeping warmly from the deep gashes in her side. Her eyes found the boy. He was staring not at the dead grizzly, but at her. His face was no longer terrified. It was filled with a profound, stunned awe. He took a hesitant step toward her, then another. He looked at her wound, then at his own. He knew he had been saved from certain death by an act of impossible courage. But just as a fragile thread of understanding was being woven between them, the forest itself seemed to come alive. There was no sound, no snapping twigs. One moment they were alone. The next, the clearing was ringed with them. A dozen silent figures, materializing from the shadows of the pines like spirits. They were Cherokee warriors, their faces grim, their eyes as hard as flint. Their collective gaze fell upon the scene, the dead grizzly, the injured boy of their tribe, and the white woman covered in blood, holding a rifle. To their eyes, it was not a rescue. It was an execution, and she was the executioner. One warrior, taller than the rest, with a stern, weathered face marked by a single scar, stepped forward. His eyes, dark and piercing, held an ancient authority. This was Chief Kalanu, the boy's father. His gaze swept over his son, a flicker of relief quickly masked. Then his eyes locked onto Abigail's. There was no gratitude in them, only deep, penetrating scrutiny. Another warrior, younger and with a fire of pure hatred in his eyes, moved to the chief's side. His name was Anacona, or White Owl, known for his unyielding hatred for the encroaching settlers. He pointed a finger at Abigail, speaking in the Cherokee tongue, his voice sharp and accusatory. He assumed she was a trapper, that her snares had endangered the boy, that she was somehow responsible for all of this. The boy, whose name was Tyann, saw the hostility and found his voice. "No!" he cried out in Cherokee. "She saved me! The bear! She killed the bear!" Kalanu held up a hand, silencing them both. He walked slowly into the center of the clearing. He knelt beside the massive bear, his experienced hunter's eye reading the story in the tracks, the blood, the gouges in the earth. He saw where the boy had been cornered, where the woman had stood her ground, where she had fallen and where she had made her final, impossible attack. It was a story of unbelievable bravery. He rose and walked over to Abigail. He towered over her, an imposing figure of authority. He said nothing, simply looking at her, weighing her, judging her. He saw the blood soaking her side, the grit in her eyes. He spoke, his voice a low rumble, in halting, heavily accented English. "You are hurt." Abigail nodded, her throat too dry to speak. Kalanu gestured to his son. "You save him." It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. "The bear was going to kill him," Abigail managed to say. Onakona stepped forward again, his voice dripping with suspicion. "Why? Why does a white woman help a Cherokee boy? Your kind only takes from us." Before Abigail could answer, Kalanu spoke a sharp command in their own language. Onakona fell silent, his jaw tight with resentment. Kalanu's attention returned to Abigail. He saw the paleness spreading across her face as the blood loss took its toll. "You cannot stay here," he stated. "You will die." He made a decision, his face unreadable. "You will come with us." It was not an invitation. It was a command. Two warriors stepped forward. One gently took the Winchester from her unresisting hands. The other moved to support her as her knees began to buckle. The world was tilting, the edges of her vision going dark. Her last conscious sight was of Chief Kalanu lifting his son into his arms, his stern face for a moment softening with a father's love. She had saved the boy, but she had not earned her freedom. She was now a captive, being taken to the heart of a people who had every reason to hate her. Her fate rested entirely in the hands of a stern chief whose judgment was as sharp and unforgiving as the Wyoming winter. The next 5 days would not be a period of recovery. They would be a trial. Abigail drifted in and out of consciousness. Her world was a confusing blur of swaying movement, hushed voices, and the persistent, throbbing fire in her side. When she finally opened her eyes to a lucid world, she was no longer in the forest. She lay on a soft bed of buffalo hides inside a teepee. A small fire glowed in a central pit. The air smelled of wood smoke and herbs. Her wound had been treated. The gashes were covered with a poultice of mashed green leaves, held in place by a clean linen bandage. The pain was still there, a dull, heavy ache, but the searing agony was gone. An older woman, her face a beautiful web of wrinkles, sat silently by the fire. She was the healer named Noya. She offered Abigail a bowl of warm, bitter broth. Abigail drank it gratefully. For 2 days, this was her world. The teepee, the quiet presence of Noya, and the muffled sounds of the village outside. She was a patient, but she was also a prisoner. Warriors stood a discreet distance from her teepee day and night. On the third day, she felt strong enough to walk. With Noya's help, she stepped outside. The village was a collection of some 30 teepees nestled in a hidden mountain valley. Women were tanning hides, men were fletching arrows. It was a community fighting to maintain its way of life in a hostile world. Her appearance caused an immediate stir. All activity ceased. All eyes turned to her. She saw curiosity, resentment, and in a few, a flicker of respect. She saw the boy, Tyann, playing with other children. He saw her and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she saw Onakona. He stood with a group of other young men, his face a mask of contempt. He believed her act of bravery was a trick, a deception. "The White Witch lives," he said, loud enough for her to hear. "Does she seek to trade her magic for our lands?" Abigail ignored him. Showing fear would only confirm his prejudice. Her real test came later that day. Chief Kalanu summoned her to his teepee. Tian sat beside him, watching her with solemn eyes. "You are stronger," Kalanu stated. "Thanks to your people's care," Abigail replied. "Noya is a great healer," he said. "She says the bear's claws were poisoned by rot. Without her herbs, the fever would have taken you." He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. "You saved my son. I have given you your life in return. The debt is paid." Abigail's heart sank. She had hope for safe passage, for understanding. "What happens now?" she asked. "That is what our council will decide," Kalanu said. "Onakona believes you are a scout for the army. They say you should be killed before you can bring others to our sanctuary." "And you?" Abigail dared to ask. "What do you believe?" Kalanu's gaze was unflinching. "I believe what I see. I saw you fight a grizzly for a boy you did not know. But the heart of a white person is a mystery. We have learned this through much sorrow. My son's life is precious, but the survival of our people is everything." Her life was a political calculation. Gratitude was a luxury he could not afford. Just then, a scout burst into the teepee, his face grim. He spoke rapidly to Kalanu in Cherokee. The chief's face darkened. Kalanu looked at Abigail, a new cold light in his eyes. "My scout reports riders near the eastern pass," he said in English. "White men, heavily armed. They fly the brand of Jedediah Kane." The name sent a chill down Abigail's spine. Kane was a ruthless cattle baron who believed in manifest destiny with a rifle. He was the very reason she and Caleb had sought out such an isolated valley. "One of them," Kalanu continued, his voice dangerously low, "found tracks leading from your cabin. Tracks of a woman being carried, surrounded by unshod ponies. They believe we kidnapped you. They are following us." Suddenly, everything shifted. She was no longer just a suspicious outsider. In the eyes of Onakona and many others, she was now the source of a direct and imminent threat. She was the breadcrumb trail that had led the wolf to their hidden door. Her trial had just become infinitely more deadly. The news of Cain's men spread through the village like a contagion of fear. Every face that looked at Abigail was now etched with accusation. Onakona seized the moment, his voice ringing out in a fiery sermon of condemnation. "I warned you," he declared, pointing a shaking finger toward Abigail's teepee. "She is a plague. She brings the vultures to our last sanctuary. Jedediah Kane does not ride for sport. She has led him here." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Abigail remained inside her teepee, hearing it all. Noya sat with her, her face grim, but she did not leave. Abigail's mind raced. Cain. He considered homesteaders like her to be squatters and native tribes to be vermin, both to be cleared from the land he coveted. Kalanu called a council of his senior warriors. Their angry, debating voices could be heard for hours. Abigail knew her fate was being decided within those hide walls. Meanwhile, Kalanu had sent his best scouts to shadow Cain's party. They returned after nightfall with disturbing news. It wasn't just a scouting party. It was a group of a dozen men led by Cain's infamous foreman, a brutal man named Finn. They had found her cabin, and they had burned it to the ground. The home she and Caleb had built, the last physical remnant of her old life, was now a pile of smoldering ash. The news struck Abigail with the force of a physical blow. She had nothing left in the world now but the clothes on her back and the life she was fighting to keep. But the scouts brought back one more piece of information, a detail that would change everything. While looting her cabin, one of Cain's men had found her husband's journal. The scout, who had learned some English, had crept close enough to hear them laughing as they read passages from it. They mocked Caleb's dreams, but they were particularly interested in his detailed entries about the valley. The defensible positions, the location of the best spring, the game trails. Then came the final damning piece. One of Cain's men had said, "The chief was right. The Cherokee band the army drove off last spring must have come through here. This valley is perfect. Once we clear out this squatter's nest and any redskins hiding in the hills, this whole territory is ours for the taking." When Kalanu was told this, he understood. Cain hadn't been led here by Abigail. He had been coming here all along. Her presence and her abduction was merely a convenient pretext, a perfect excuse to move in with force and claim he was rescuing a citizen or avenging her death. Kalanu emerged from his teepee. The entire village was gathered. Onakona stood before them, still fanning the flames of their fear. "We must give her to them," Onakona was shouting. "A sacrifice to appease the beast." "Silence!" Kalanu's voice boomed across the encampment. The authority in his tone was absolute. He walked to the center of the circle. "Onakona speaks with the passion of a warrior," Kalanu began, his voice calm but powerful. "But his eyes are clouded by old hatreds. He sees the spark, but mistakes the source of the fire." He recounted what the scouts had seen and heard. He told them about Cain's men mapping their land before they ever found Abigail's trail. He told them of the plan to exterminate any redskins they found. "This woman," he said, turning his gaze toward Abigail, who had emerged from her teepee, "is not the cause of our trouble. She is, like us, in the path of the storm. Jedediah Cain does not want one woman's homestead. He wants this valley. He wants our water, our game, the very ground beneath our feet. Giving him this woman would not sate his hunger. It would only be an appetizer." The crowd was silent. Their anger and fear now mingled with a dawning, terrible understanding. The true enemy was not the lone woman who had bled for one of their children. The true enemy was the shadow that had been looming over them all along. Kalanu walked over to Abigail. The eyes of his entire tribe were on them. Judgment was at hand. "The debt between us is paid in blood," he said, his voice softer now. "But the world has created a new debt, a debt of survival. Your enemy is now our enemy. Your fight is now our fight." He looked back at his people. "Onakona sees a white woman, an enemy. I see a warrior who faced a grizzly with nothing but a knife to save one of our own. I see a survivor whose home has been turned to ash by the same man who would see us starved or driven into the winter snows. Her courage is a weapon we will need." He turned back to Abigail, his face set. "The council has decided. You are not our prisoner, and you are not our sacrifice." He paused, the anticipation in the air so thick it was hard to breathe. "We ask you to be our ally." The chief's words hung in the cold night air, stunning the assembled tribe into silence. Ally. The word was a seismic shock. Onakona stared, his mouth agape. Tyann, standing near his father, looked at Abigail with undisguised pride. Abigail felt a dizzying mix of relief and disbelief. She had been prepared for a death sentence or banishment. An alliance was something she could never have conceived. She looked at Kalanu and saw a brilliant pragmatist, a leader making the only move on the board that offered a chance at victory. "An ally?" Onakona finally sputtered. "We would ally ourselves with a snake because it bites our enemy? She is not one of us." "Her people are not one solid tribe," Kalanu countered, his voice firm. "There are the Cain men, who see the land only as something to be conquered. And there are the homesteaders like her, who wish only to live. The wolf does not distinguish between the lone sheep and the shepherd. To Cain, we are all just obstacles." He turned his attention back to Abigail. The entire village watched, waiting. "We do not ask you to become Cherokee," he clarified. "We ask you to stand with us, as we will stand with you. Your rifle is true. Your courage is proven. You know the mind of men like Cain in a way we do not. We have knowledge of this land, of moving without a sound, of fighting in the shadows. Alone we may both be broken. Together we may survive." This was not born of sentiment. It was a hard, practical thing forged in the crucible of mutual desperation, an acknowledgement that their shared enemy was a greater force than their historical division. Abigail looked around at the faces in the firelight. She saw women watching with cautious hope. She saw warriors, their animosity replaced by a grudging respect. She looked at Noya, who gave her a slow, encouraging nod, and at Tyan, the boy whose life was now inextricably linked with her own. Her cabin was gone. Her husband was gone. Her old life was a ghost. These people, in their own way, had also lost everything. They were survivors just like her. She straightened her shoulders, the pain in her side a dull reminder of the fight that started it all. She met Kalanu's gaze, her own eyes clear and resolved. "I have nothing left to go back to," she said, her voice clear and carrying across the silent camp. "The man who burned my home is the same man who wants to destroy yours. My fight is already your fight. I accept your offer. I will be your ally." A sigh of collective relief went through the crowd. Kalanu nodded, a grave smile touching his lips for the first time. "Then it is done." He turned to his people and spoke in the rolling tones of their native tongue. He finished by speaking a phrase that held special weight. The assembled tribe repeated it after him, their voices a unified chorus. Later, Tyan approached her. "What did your father say?" Abigail asked him. "The last words." Tyan looked up at her, his young face serious. "He told them, 'We are now Dudatlis Diskavi, we who are bound together as one people. It is a pledge of loyalty. It means your enemies are buried in our ground, and our enemies fall to your rifle. It means we share the same fire, the same food, the same future. Bound together as one people." The weight and the beauty of it settled over Abigail. 5 days ago, she had been a widow, alone. Now she had a purpose, a future, and impossibly, a family. She had saved a Cherokee boy from a grizzly bear. And in doing so, she had found a tribe. The loyalty wasn't a gift. It was a pact sealed in the face of annihilation, a promise to face the coming storm. Not as strangers, but as one. The alliance was not given time to age. It was thrown immediately into the fire. Jedediah Kane's foreman, Finn, was not a patient man. Emboldened by the easy destruction of Abigail's cabin and convinced he was dealing with a scattered, frightened remnant of a tribe, he decided to press his advantage. The plan was simple and brutal, a swift, overwhelming assault at dawn. But Kalanu's scouts were his eyes and ears. They saw Finn's party of 12 men arming for an attack. There was no time to run. The stand had to be made here and now. A council of war was held around the central fire. This time, Abigail stood beside Kalanu. "They will come up the main pass," Onakona stated, drawing a map in the dirt. "It is the only way for a dozen riders to approach with speed. We can meet them there, warrior to warrior." "That's what they'll expect," Abigail said, her voice quiet but firm. All eyes turned to her. "They think you're savages who will charge out and be cut down by their repeating rifles. They're arrogant. They'll ride in bunched up, making easy targets." She looked at Kalanu. "But they won't be expecting a ghost on the ridge." A plan began to form, one that blended Cherokee tactics with a frontiersman's cunning. In the hours before dawn, 6 of Kalanu's best warriors, including Onakona, armed with bows, melted into the forest on the left side of the narrow pass. Their job was not to kill, but to create chaos by taking out the horses. 4 more warriors with rifles took up positions behind a rockfall on the right, a perfect ambush point. Abigail's role was different. Kalanu guided her up a steep, hidden trail to a high ledge overlooking the entire pass. The position was perfect. Over 300 yards from the trail below, far beyond the effective range of the pistols and carbines Kane's men would be carrying. But it was not beyond the range of Caleb's Winchester. From here, she could act as a sniper. She was their eye in the sky. As the first hints of gray light touched the eastern peaks, Abigail lay prone on the cold rock, the Winchester resting on a small pile of stones. Below, the valley was a sea of mist. She saw the Cherokee warriors move into their final positions, so silent and fluid they barely seemed real. She felt a strange sense of belonging. She was no longer a lone woman. She was part of a living, breathing defense. Soon she heard them, the clink of horseshoes on rock, a coarse laugh. Finn's posse was riding into the trap. They came as she predicted, clustered together, confident they were on a simple extermination mission. She sighted on the lead rider, Finn himself, a big bearded man with a cruel face. She didn't fire. The signal was Kalanu's. It came as a perfectly imitated hawk's cry from the trees below. Instantly, the quiet pass erupted into lethal chaos. A volley of arrows whispered from the woods. 3 horses went down, screaming. The posse, caught by surprise, descended into confusion. Then the 4 rifles from the rockfall opened up. 2 of Kane's men were knocked from their saddles before they even knew what was happening. Finn, experienced and vicious, rallied his remaining men. "It's the trees to the left! Fire into the trees!" he bellowed, dismounting and taking cover behind his fallen horse. This was Abigail's moment. From her perch, she saw it all with perfect clarity. Finn was organizing a defense. He was the brain. She centered the Winchester sights on his chest, accounted for the distance, and gently squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. Far below, a fraction of a second later, Finn was thrown backward as if hit by a sledgehammer. The shot was perfect. Chaos turned to outright panic. Her position was so unexpected, so far away, that the men below couldn't tell where the deadly fire was coming from. Her next shot took down a gunslinger scrambling for cover. With their leader gone and another man down from an unseen rifle, the remaining riders broke. They turned their horses and galloped madly back down the pass, pursued by the triumphant shouts of Kalanu's warriors. The battle had lasted less than 5 minutes. When Abigail made her way back down, the Cherokee were emerging from the woods. They looked at her with a new level of reverence. Onakona approached her, his face smudged with dirt. He stopped and looked at her rifle, then at her. "The shot on Finn," he said, his tone stripped of its earlier contempt. "It was the shot of a true warrior." He gave her a sharp, respectful nod and walked away. It was the highest praise he was capable of giving. Kalanu came to her side, his face grimly satisfied. "Today we showed the wolf our teeth," he said. "This is not the end. Kane will send more men, but today the Dudatlas Diskivi drew first blood, together." Abigail looked at the rising sun illuminating the valley, at the brave people who had accepted her as one of their own. Her home was ash. Her past was buried. But for the first time in 2 years, she wasn't looking back. She was looking forward to the next fight, the next sunrise, a future she would face not alone, but with her tribe. Their battle against Jedediah Kane was just beginning, but they would face it together, a tribe of 2 worlds united by a pledge of loyalty more sacred than any law written on paper. If this story of courage and survival resonated with you, show your support. Hit that like button, share this video, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales from the untamed heart of the past. Click the notification bell so you won't miss what happens next. Thank you for listening.